Zo, beste collega's, beste studenten, beste vrienden. De volgende inaugurale rede wordt verzorgd door professor Dr. Christina Kreinecker. Professor Kreinecker is a BOF research professor at the Research Unit of Biblical Studies at our faculty. She studied theology, classics, and philosophy at the University of Salzburg, the Università di Roma, La Sapienza, and the Pontificia Università Gregoriana in Rome. Recent kreeg professor Kreinecker van het FVO een zeer prestigieuze Odysseus type 1-beurs voor een 5-jarig project over de eerste brief aan de Corinthiërs, text, transmission and translation of the first letter to the Corinthians in the first millennium. We zijn bijzonder verheugd als faculteit over haar keuze om onze staf aan de KU Leuven te versterken. En ik verleen u graag het woord aan professor Bieringer, de coördinator ad interim van de onderzoekseenheid Bijbelwetenschap, die haar zal inleiden.
Geachte Dames en Heren, geachte Dekan, geachte Vice-Dekanen, geachte genodigden, vrienden en familie van professor Kreinecker. Geachte collega's, medewerkers, studenten. Ik beschouw het als een voorrecht professor Dr. Christina Maria Kreinecker ter gelegenheid van haar inaugurale rede te mogen inleiden. Het is enerzijds jammer dat we om sanitaire redenen hier in deze grote plechtige ruimte alleen maar met enkele mensen mogen samenkomen, maar anderzijds is het ook een kans, omdat in dit formaat vele mensen kunnen deelnemen, voor wie het anders misschien niet mogelijk zou zijn om vandaag naar Leuven te komen. Omwille van het speciale internationale karakter van deze inaugurale rede is het onvermijdelijk dat deze inleiding meertalig zal zijn. Bovendien zal meertaligheid ook inhoudelijk de rode draad zijn van de inaugurale rede van professor Kreinecker. Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, Familienmitglieder, Freundinnen und Freunde von Professor Kreinecker. Es ist mir eine besondere Ehre und Freude, Professor Dr. Christina Maria Kreinecker bei ihrer Antrittsvorlesung als neue Kollegin in unserer theologischen Fakultät vorstellen zu dürfen. Als ich sich an unsere Fakultät bewarb, war ich Koordinator der Forschungsabteilung Exegese. In dieser Funktion habe ich sie im Bewerbungsprozess beraten und habe sie so gewissermaßen als Lotse in die Wasser der neuen Welt unserer flämischen Universität begleitet. Da unsere neue Koordinatorin, Professor Benedikt Lemmelein, zurzeit ein Sabbatsemester hat, ist mir die Aufgabe zugefallen, heute hier vor Ihnen zu stehen. Dieser Zufall freut mich ganz besonders, weil sich hiermit der Kreis schließt und meine Lotsenaufgabe zu ihrem Abschluss kommt. Dear Mr. Dean, dear invited guests and friends of Professor Kreinecker, dear colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, it is a special joy and privilege to introduce to you our new colleague, Professor Dr. Christina Maria Kreinecker, at the occasion of her inaugural lecture. When Professor Kreinecker joined our faculty here in Leuven as a research professor in the fall of 2019, Corona was for most of us nothing more than the Latin word for crown. And no one had the slightest idea how radically the world would soon change as a consequence of a pandemic. 3 of Professor Kreinecker's 4 semesters in our faculty have so far been Corona semesters. But this unexpected situation has not been able to slow down her successful initiation and integration into our faculty. Despite the limitations of the different phases of the lockdown, by way of her enthusiastic engagement in learning Dutch, she is becoming more multilingual every day. The university education of Christina Kreinecker is impressive, to say the least. After her BA in philosophy in 2004, in a span of a mere 6 years, she completed 2 MA degrees and 2 doctorates in theology and classics respectively, all of them summa cum laude. Her doctorate in theology in 2008 was awarded sub auspiciis Presidentis Rei Publicae, that is, in the presence of the President of the Austrian Republic, an honor that only the most excellent students receive. 2 years later, in 2010, she completed her doctorate in classics. During her studies, she received many awards and scholarships. One of them, an Erasmus scholarship, enabled her to study in Rome at the Gregorian and at La Sapienza. The dean referred to it just a moment ago. Here she also came in contact with the annual Latin summer schools of the late Professor Father Reginald Foster, a Carmelite who was one of the Pope's Latinists and a world-renowned professor of Latin, a teacher whose love for the Latin language had a lasting effect on Professor Kreinecker. The research experience of Professor Kreinecker is closely associated with the University of Salzburg, Austria, where she was involved in research in the papyrological commentaries in cooperation with Professor Peter As Grabner. After her second doctorate, she spent time at the University of Chicago as a visiting scholar. Between 2011 and 2013, she was a research fellow at the Institute for Textual Scholarship and Electronic Editing at the University of Birmingham. From 2013 onwards, she was an assistant professor and later associate professor of New Testament at the University of Salzburg. Professor Kreinecker has a rich academic teaching experience. I will not take the time to list all the courses she has taught before she even came to Leuven. I just want to mention one way in which she expressed her Einfühlungsvermögen, her close affinity with the world she studies and teaches, in a recent interview when she said, I quote, "When thinking about the ancient world, I have always been fascinated by the question as to who I would have been in that society, the daughter of a rich family or a slave perhaps. How would it have felt to walk over the Forum Romanum?" Since 2017, Professor Kreinecker has been a regular contributor to the annual meetings of the Society of Biblical Literature held in the United States of America. In addition, she was invited to present papers at many conferences around the world. She has 3 books to her name as the author and co-author. Her first book in 2008 focuses on the Coptic witnesses of resurrection narratives. Her second book in 2010 is a papyrological commentary on 2 Thessalonians. In 2019, she co-authored a book on the Old Latin witnesses of the principal Pauline epistles. Moreover, she published many scholarly articles in leading journals and book series. Her conference papers and articles often concentrate on aspects of daily life, as seen in documentary papyri. For instance, the title of one of her most recent articles, Everyday Life of Women at the Time of the New Testament in Documentary Papyri. Professor Kreinecker has ample experience of working as a researcher in various research projects. As the dean already announced, she will now in the future have the opportunity to be the principal investigator of her own projects. Exactly 1 month ago, we received the wonderful news, the dean mentioned it, that the Flemish Research Foundation had awarded one of its most prestigious Odysseus Type 1 grants, namely major research funding, to Professor Kreinecker's project in New Testament textual criticism. I quote from the project summary. The project's aim is to produce digital text-critical editions and studies of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, including the Greek Editio Critica Major and the Vetus Latina, which will replace the outdated editions from the 18th and 19th century. Congratulations. We are very proud that one of the members of our faculty and of our research unit has received this prestigious grant, and we look forward to the research results. With this project, Professor Kreinecker understands herself to stand in the best of Louvain tradition. I quote her words again. In terms of multilingual studies, there is a tradition of studying multiple ancient languages that goes back to the Collegium Trilingue. Studying her project text and seeing her focus on Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and Arabic, I began to wonder if this research will be the beginning of a new collegium, but this time a Collegium Quinque Lingue. Multilingualism and the New Testament is Professor Kreinecker's major research interest, as you can see in this project. In the same interview that I quoted earlier, she stated, and I quote again, and this is particularly important, I think, because she puts everything into a theological perspective. The New Testament translations also have a theological meaning. No one was ever afraid to lose something in the translation of the text. The Holy Bible is not holy in just one language or version. It is a multilingual and multicultural project. There are so many variant forms. It is an open, living tradition. It is not that the Greek New Testament is the only real version and that the translations are inferior. After all, Jesus and his disciples would have spoken Aramaic. So the Greek New Testament itself is a translation of their words. This is how Christianity spread, by getting time and again translated into another context. End of quote. And with this, we have arrived at the focus of Professor Kreinecker's inaugural lecture, which is entitled The New Testament in its Multilingual Context, the Significance of Studying Manuscripts. Professor Kreinecker, we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much indeed for this wonderful trilingual introduction, and thank you for the warm welcome at our research unit. Geachte Rektor, geachte Vizerektoren, geachte Dekan, geachte Vizedekane, geachte Professoren, dear colleagues, dear students, dear family and friends. Thank you for being here today to mark this day as a special one, be it in the room, be it via live stream. Just to acknowledge how widely we are connected this afternoon, I want to say good morning to Cochabamba in Bolivia. I say good morning to the US, to California and Illinois. Hello, Chicago. I know that friends and colleagues in Britain join us today at tea time from Edinburgh to Birmingham, and many colleagues and friends are here from Italy, Germany, and Austria, including Augsburg, Vienna, Linz, and Salzburg. Good afternoon. And a very good evening to my colleagues and friends in Australia. Hartelijk dank voor uw aanwezigheid. Het spijt me dat we op dit moment niet samen hier in één zaal kunnen zijn, maar ik ben blij en dankbaar dat er een livestream is. Daar zeg ik dank voor aan Evelyn Deneke, die alles heeft zo mooi georganiseerd. Aan mijn fantastische leerkrachten van het ILT heb ik het te danken dat ik al iets in het Nederlands kan zeggen. Maar het is helaas helemaal nog niet genoeg om het over mijn onderzoek in het Nederlands te hebben. En hoewel nu al zoveel is gezegd, hoeveel talen en zo verder, ik moet vandaag in het Nederlands, niet in het Nederlands, maar in het Engels spreken. My Dutch is not yet good enough, I think I just proved that, to speak about my research, and therefore I will give this inaugural lecture in English. When I asked our dean what the purpose of an inaugural lecture at our faculty is, he said to let my colleagues here in Leuven know what my research is all about. That is easily done, because I love manuscripts and I love ancient languages. And this is what my research on the New Testament is all about, manuscripts and languages. So my inaugural lecture will be about the significance of studying manuscripts for understanding the New Testament. I will talk about this from the perspective of my current research and my future research. There are two different sets of manuscripts that I work with. Biblical manuscripts, those are usually written in a very legible script, and documentary papyri, that is text from ancient everyday life, and those are usually written in a less legible script. Both types of manuscripts are of high significance for studying and understanding the New Testament. Let me give you a famous example right at the beginning. In the greetings of Romans 16:7, two prominent apostles are named, Andronicus and Junia. While it was always clear in antiquity that the first was a man and the second a woman, from the 13th century onwards, Junia was turned into a man. And it was only in the second half of the 20th century when, with the detailed study of biblical manuscripts, including the old translations, Junia was restored as a woman. I remember that in November 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president of the US, newspapers were full of praise what an empowering effect this would have on the younger generation in how far they can come in life, no matter what their background would be. And similar observations were made last year when Kamala Harris was elected vice president of the US. Now, taking this as a comparison, I do not see why we should be less enthusiastic about Junia, the apostle, and what positive empowering effect she may have on girls and women in Christian communities. So, to set the agenda right at the beginning, I suggest not to underestimate the significance of the study of manuscripts for the societies in which we live today. I will start this lecture by talking about my current research, and I will do so in two parts. I will first talk about biblical manuscripts and then about documentary papyri. For both, I shall give 2 examples. My current research project is a KU Leuven Internal Fund startup grant entitled New Testament in Translation. What is it about? The first thought that may come to our mind when we hear the word translation may be translating from one language to another. And this is indeed one part of what this project is about. The 27 writings that we call the New Testament were written in Greek somewhere between the year 50 and approximately 135 CE. None of these autographs have survived. The oldest fragmentary evidence that we have dates to the second half of the 2nd century CE, but for the first complete codices, we have to go to the 4th century. Translations of the Greek text, so-called versions, occur from the 2nd century onwards. These are translations into Latin, Syriac, and Coptic, but just like in Greek, the first complete manuscripts of these translations date to the 4th century. And this is why studying these versions in comparison to the Greek text is so significant, because those translations can point to a Greek text from which they have been translated, that is different from the text preserved in Greek manuscripts that have survived today. This means that the Greek templates or exemplars from which these translations of the Greek text into Latin, Syriac, and Coptic were made have not survived, but their text may have survived through the translations that we have. And it becomes more complicated, because not only do we not have those Greek exemplars, we also do not have the first translations. Our manuscript evidence today is incomplete. What we have is copies of copies of copies. And of course, with every copy come changes. With every copy comes cross-influence from other manuscripts, from other readings, and these texts become mixed forms. This phenomenon is known as contamination, and it's needless to say that this causes a problem when analyzing these manuscripts. Let me give you 2 examples to illustrate these challenges, one from Latin and one from Coptic. In John 6:71, we read a Greek text that translates into English, but he, Jesus, was speaking of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, for he was going to hand him over, one of the 12. Several Greek manuscripts add a present tense participle of the verb to be. So they would read, he, Jesus, was speaking of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, for he was going to hand him over, being one of the 12. This is the case in Papyrus 66 from the 3rd or 4th century, in the famous Majuscule Codex Synaeticus from the 4th century, and also in a set of later minuscules known as Family 1 and Family 13. When we look at the Latin translation, this becomes interesting. The Stuttgart Vulgate reads the following text. But he was speaking of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, for he would hand him over. And now, what do we do with cum esset? Already my first Latin teacher, Dr. Seitz, taught me that there are 4 different ways to translate the Latin word cum with the subjunctive: causal, narrative, adversative, and concessive. The first one would be because Judas was one of the 12. This would make for an interesting theological implication. Narrative would be while at the time when he was one of the 12, and adversative and concessive would go in the direction of although. And of course, this is how it's usually understood. Although he was one of the 12, he handed Jesus over. In comparison to the Greek, we can observe that the Latin translation is based on a Greek text that had the form being, a Greek participle present tense active voice. So this is the first major observation. The second is that the Latin language cannot mirror the Greek text because it does not have a participle present tense active voice of the word to be, at least not until a couple hundred years later when the word ens was introduced in philosophical debates. So Latin had to paraphrase this Greek participle, and the majority of manuscripts read cum esset, which, as I've just discussed, already interprets the participle in its translation. A more neutral way, we may say, would be a relative clause. Qui unus erat, Judas who was one of the 12. That does not leave the doubt of because or although. One old Latin codex, Codex Palatinus from the 5th century and North Italy, reads this relative clause. But there's more to the story when comparing it to the Greek, because there's one manuscript in Latin that follows a Greek text without the participle being. And this is Codex Bisai, the famous 5th century bilingual codex with the Greek text on the left and the Latin on the right. Now, the Latin text in this codex is not a direct translation of the Greek text on the left. But having said that, at this place there is a connection, because both Greek and Latin read the text without the word being, and this is unique in the Latin tradition. This was my first example from the Latin translations to illustrate how complex but also how fascinating the correlations between the Greek texts and its translations can be. My second example to illustrate this is from the Coptic transmission. In the resurrection accounts of the Gospels, it is women who come to the tomb on the morning of the 3rd day after Jesus died. In Mark 16, these women are Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. There is a debate whether there are 3 or 4 women present, but this is not what I want to point out today. I want to show how grammar can reveal relationships between readings. In Mark 16:4, the Greek text says, following again the critical edition of Nestle Aland 28 and translating it into English, and looking up, they see that the stone has been rolled away, for it was very large. The Coptic language has a text that looks quite different at first glance. When they raised their eyes, they saw the stone in that way that they had carried it away from there, for it was very large. Now, there would be many things to say, but I want to focus on 2. First of all, what should not bother us is that the passive voice has been rolled away is translated by a 3rd person plural in the active voice they had carried away, because the Coptic language does not have a morphological equivalent for the Greek passive voice. So the fact that there's a difference here is not as exciting as it may seem. What is more exciting from a text critical perspective is, second of all, the object of the seeing is different. In Greek, the woman see, we could say, the entire picture, because the entire hoti clause is the object for the seeing in Greek. In Coptic, however, the woman saw the stone, so the stone is the object which is then described further. The Coptic language would have the possibility to express exactly what the Greek has, that is seeing plus the subordinate clause, but it does not do so. Yet there are other readings in the Greek transmission to which the Coptic corresponds. One example is the famous Codex Synaeticus from the 4th century. The text here has exactly the grammatical construction that we see translated in Coptic. This grammatical construction is called ACP, accusative with participle. And it is regularly seen with verbs that express seeing. Now, in Coptic, it is not a participle, but a circumstantial transposition, but that is grammatically the grammatical equivalent to the participle in Greek. So there's no doubt the Coptic goes with those Greek manuscripts that have a participle and not a hoti clause. Again, there would be much more to say, because there is a further variation down the line, and also the Latin transmission has the ACP construction. But my main point here was to show how fascinating and how complex it is to look at the connections between the Greek text and its early translations more broadly. Before I gave these 2 examples from biblical manuscripts, the one in John about Judas being one of the 12 and the women seeing the stone, I said that the title of my project, New Testament in Translation, would most likely make us think of translations from one language to another. Yet there is also another dimension when it comes to translations, and this is not so much translating individual words, phrases, or sentences from one language to another. It is more translating the context and the meaning of what is said into another context. And this is a fundamental question when studying the New Testament. How does one translate an ancient Mediterranean worldview that is underlying all New Testament writings into a secular worldview of Western Europe in the 21st century? Now, I'm sure my colleagues from Pastoral Theology, and Professor Anne van den Hoek is present, can tell a thing or two about this problem from their research and expertise. There is no single or easy answer to that challenge. But as a New Testament scholar, I think ancient manuscripts can help us in facing this challenge. And this brings me to my second set of manuscripts that I work with, and that is documentary papyri. Documentary papyri are texts from ancient everyday life, that is, everything that was not intended for the general public, as we usually say about literary texts. So, for example, official documents, wills, contracts of all sorts, business letters, personal letters, census declarations, accounts, court proceedings, birth certificates, whatever text everyday life produces. In terms of material, these texts from everyday life are written on papyrus, on ostraca, that is pieces of pottery, the cheapest writing material there was in antiquity, and on wooden tablets, of which various forms are preserved, many from military contexts like Vindolanda in Britain or Vindonissa in Switzerland. Reading those texts is fascinating and provides a colorful picture of the past, though not a complete one. One of the first scholars who pointed out the importance of documentary papyri for the study of the New Testament was the German scholar Adolf Deissmann at the beginning of the 20th century. In his book, Light from the Ancient East, in the 4th edition in 1923 in German, Licht vom Osten, translated 1927 into English, he differentiates 3 dimensions in which documentary papyri are of significance for biblical studies. They are significant linguistically, literary historically, and socio-historically. Since Deissmann, times have changed. The amount of published documentary papyri has changed. Today we have approximately 8 times more material than at the beginning of the 20th century. That is more than 50,000 published documentary papyri. And of course, we have changed as well. And our methodology for analyzing has changed. And here I want to mention again the papyrological commentaries on the New Testament with its headquarters in Salzburg and Peter Arts Grabner. I have worked with this papyrological material for many years now, and I have benefited in my work from the Leuven-based Trismegistos research platform and its Leuven database of ancient books. Being now myself at KU Leuven, I look forward to collaborating with my colleagues from the arts faculty, Marc Tepon and his team. With my first example from documentary papyri today, I want to illustrate how much there is to learn from these texts for the socio-historical understanding of the ancient world, but also for the socio-historical understanding of the New Testament. And this example concerns women in Greco-Roman antiquity. Documentary papyri hold more information about the actual life of women than any literary source. For example, concerning their social status in general, their involvement in legal matters, and the important economic role they played. Did you, for example, know that women owned property and paid taxes for it? That between 1/5 to 1/3 of landowners in Roman Egypt were women, and 16 to 25% of all land belonged to women. And once this is acknowledged, it may not come as a surprise to hear that women managed their own affairs. One example for this is a letter by a certain Thais from the 2nd century CE to her steward, Tigrios. She writes, "Thais to her Tigrios greeting. I wrote to Apollinarius to come to Petne for the measuring. Apollinarius will tell you how the deposits and the taxes stand. He will tell you the name, whatever it is. If you come, take out 6 measures of vegetable seed and seal them in sacks so that they may be ready. And if you can, go up and find out about the donkey. Sarah Podora and Sabino salute you. Do not sell the piglets without me. Goodbye. We meet here a woman, Thais, who gives very clear instructions and seems very much involved with the daily transactions, such as selling piglets. Examples like these, of course, also shed new lights on women in the New Testament, be it the businesswoman Lydia in Acts 16:14, a dealer in purple cloth, be it the many women in Luke 8:3 who provided for Jesus and his followers, as the text says, out of their resources. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg to point towards the significance of documentary papyri for understanding the socio-historical world of the New Testament. And I'm convinced that a better understanding of what the text could have meant in its ancient context will help us to find new ways to translate the New Testament into our current world and society. My second example from documentary papyri concerns translations themselves. When we look for translations as such in documentary papyri, there are several. For example, court proceedings in the Roman provinces, where the local people would not have spoken the language of the Roman governors. These texts occasionally point to the presence of translators and interpreters, and here the ancient world and our world today have something in common. In the ancient texts, the translator is sometimes mentioned as such in court proceedings, but not by name. And often the translator is not even mentioned at all, although the context makes it obvious that there was one. And this fascinates me because nothing has changed in that regard. Leuven is close to Brussels, a central city for the European Union, and the political debates there take place in many languages. And the documents issued afterwards are often the product of translations. Yet we hardly ever hear anything about the people who make these translations, and this despite the fact that translating is a powerful activity, and it influences, if not more, how text is understood. Just think of cum esset, is it because or although? So we as a society keep our translators and interpreters anonymous, and we do the same with our biblical translations and translators. Who is, for example, the translator of the Gospel of Luke in the New Revised Standard Version? And what is his or her background? And how does it influence the translation theologically? I do not know. But I do not see why we should not know. Documentary papyri confirm that the anonymity of translators has a long tradition, and while I would prefer transparency, I doubt that this will change anytime soon. Now, these were 4 examples from my current research on New Testament in translation to illustrate how fascinating and complex working with texts in multiple languages can be. Judas being one of the 12, women seeing the stone, Thais managing her own affairs, and translators who we do not know. I am not alone in being fascinated by manuscripts, texts, and their meanings, and I'm happy to say that the next generation of scholars is on its way. I am currently working with Afe Alabi, who is about to finish his master thesis on the understanding of transmission and tradition in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11. Valentin Andronake works on his PhD and conducts research on the transmission and interpretation of the second Paraclete saying in John 14 in early Christian writings. And I also would like to take this opportunity to introduce to you Dr. Anna Persic, who will join us next month as a postdoctoral scholar. She has written a dissertation at the University of Birmingham on the Latin text of the Catholic epistles and its development from the Old Latin to the Vulgate and its relationship to the Greek evidence. This, of course, makes her the ideal colleague for the New Testament in Translation project. I am delighted that she will soon be with us here at our faculty, and I wish her all the best with her new position. Before I summarize the significance of studying manuscripts, I would like to briefly talk about what the future will hold in terms of research. As has already been said, and very much to my delight, the FWO, the Research Foundation Flanders, has recently awarded to me an Odysseus Type 1 research grant entitled Text Transmission and Translation of 1 Corinthians in the First Millennium. Let me briefly share with you what this is about. There is no need to explain the importance of 1 Corinthians for the formation of Christianity at our faculty, with its long and established research expertise on the Corinthian correspondence. 1 Corinthians was written by the Apostle Paul in the early 50s of the 1st century. It is one of the most influential writings in Christianity, and it is the oldest and earliest witness of essential Christian traditions and beliefs, such as the Last Supper in chapter 11, or the resurrection of Jesus Christ in chapter 15. 1 Corinthians is also one of the most cited letters in early Christian writers and today. I just mentioned the letter's description of faith, hope, and love in chapter 13, which has become an inherent part of popular culture today and can be heard at many weddings. But on the other hand, 1 Corinthians contains gendered beliefs that have shaped the structure of Christian communities and churches until today. Like in 1 Corinthians 14:34, women should be silent in the churches. Yet despite this enormous significance of this letter, our latest text-critical editions of 1 Corinthians are centuries old, dating back to the 18th, the 19th, and early 20th century. All of them are outdated because they consider a limited number of manuscripts and because they are based on text-critical methods and criteria no longer in use. The field of New Testament textual criticism has undergone significant digital changes over the last decades, and none of these digital tools has yet been brought to its full use for the study of 1 Corinthians. The goal for this project is to produce new electronic text-critical editions for the 21st century, the Editio Critica Maya, the Vetus Latina, and a unique multilingual text-critical apparatus of additional early translations into Syriac, Coptic, Gothic, and Arabic. This will include a full application of new digital methods, including the so-called coherence-based genealogical method, and the possibilities that come with it to describe the text flow between individual manuscript readings. And thanks to the digital possibilities, these editions will include a wider range of witnesses than ever before, not only translations of the Greek text, but also biblical citations in the patristic evidence. All of this will result, and that is the plan, in new insights for alternatives to our current outdated models to explain the textual relationships in 1 Corinthians. We, a team of postdoctoral and doctoral scholars, will conduct this project at our faculty. We are scheduled to start in March 2022. We will also get a part share in scholars from the Institute of Textual Scholarship and Electronic Editing, ITSE, at the University of Birmingham. Its director, Dr. Hugh Houghton, one of the general editors for the Pauline epistles in the Editio Critica Maya series, and corresponding editor for the principal Pauline epistles for the Vetus Latina Institute. The project will also get a part share in ITSE's technical officer, Dr. Catherine Smith, and its transcription coordinator for the IGNTP, the International Greek New Testament Project, Dr. Amy Mishra. I expect this Odysseus project on 1 Corinthians to have a huge impact on Flanders and on our university and faculty, because this project will strengthen the years-long expertise in text-critical research at our faculty that is already in place. The Center for Septuagint Studies and Textual Criticism, under the direction of my colleague Benedict Lemmelin, and the Manuscript Studies by my colleagues Eber Tichela and Hector Patmer. This project will now add text-critical multilingual expertise on the New Testament, and this will put our faculty, as far as I can see, in a unique position worldwide as a research hub on manuscript studies with cutting-edge technology on the entire Bible. The impact of this project will go beyond academia, because the critical text produced in the Editio Critica Maya will become the standard text in the current New Testament hand editions, the Nestle Aland and the UBS, the United Bible Society edition. And it will thus become the standard text for almost all modern translations today, be it in printed, be it in electronic form. It is therefore no exaggeration to say that the text that we will produce here at our faculty will reach the living room of millions of households worldwide. It will take a while, but it will get there. And who knows at this point what we may find in the manuscripts and what consequences this may have among the Christian communities in which this text is read on a regular basis. This project is a dream coming true, and there are so many people who I want to thank for this. I name only a few. Our Dean, Johan de Tavernier, and our Vice Dean for Research, Johan Lehmans, my colleague Raymond Bieringer, the support team for national funding here at KU Leuven, they have been fantastic, in particular Stephanie Eggermont, and many more colleagues along the way who have supported me by providing feedback and moral support. And of course, I want to thank my colleague Hugh Houghton for agreeing to confer responsibility on me for producing the editions of 1 Corinthians here at KU Leuven. My lecture is entitled "The New Testament in its Multilingual Context, the Significance of Studying Manuscripts." It is now time to summarize what this significance is. First of all, manuscripts are a constant reminder that there is not one biblical text, but there are many versions of it. Over 10,000 manuscripts of the Bible have survived. And from the earliest attestation onwards, we see plurality and diversity in the text and in its transmission. Manuscripts are a constant reminder that the text constantly changes through the process of copying and passing it on, and it changes through translations and interpretations. This process is a living one. Or to say it with the words of David Parker and his book, The Living Text of the Gospels, the surviving manuscripts and the spoken word are not simply bearers of some prior living tradition, they are the living tradition. Therefore, studying manuscripts is like getting a vaccination against religious fundamentalism, which of course is a complex phenomenon with many mutations, but is usually based on the idea that there is one certain text and one way to understand it. Manuscripts remind us that this is not the case. Yet, like with most vaccinations these days, there remain risks. They never work 100%, and they may need regular boosters. But there is more to it, because all of this is theologically significant. At the end of the day, we are not just talking about any ancient text, we are talking about texts that are considered sacred scripture by Christians all around the world. Since the text of the Bible is considered sacred in its entirety, it is not one manuscript or one codex, it is not the text in one language only, but it is the entire package of a diverse text that constantly changes that is considered sacred. In the Roman Catholic Church, this has been acknowledged by the Second Vatican Council in its dogmatic constitution Dei Verbum, Articles 9 to 11 in particular. But this is where my colleagues from systematic theology should take over. I know that having two endings is not what the ancient rhetoricians would have recommended, but today I want to add a second ending. I would not stand here if it had not been for lucky circumstances and the support and empowerment by parents who valued education. I would not stand here without an Austrian government that offered quality school and university education without fees and granted study allowances, not loans. And I would also not stand here without the constant support of friends and colleagues all around the world, and I could not be more grateful. Thank you for your attention.
Besluitend wil ik nogmaals zeggen, namens de faculteit, namens de collega's aanwezig en de collega's thuis of op de faculteit, wil ik nogmaals zeggen dat de beide collega's Shaima Agatour en Christina Kreinecker van harte welkom zijn als nieuw lid van onze facultaire gemeenschap. Ik hoop dat u overtuigd geraakt bent dat de beide collega's een belangrijke versterking zijn van de faculteit. Both colleagues will strengthening the research capacity of the faculty. I would like to thank them very seriously to communicate about their ambitions for the future years at our faculty. I would like to thank also the coordinators at interim of the two research units, Professor Biering en Professor de Mazeneer. Ik wil zeker van harte mevrouw Evelien de Necker danken om dit alles hier in goede banen te leiden. Dank je wel voor die uitstekende organisatie. En jammer dat er geen receptie kan volgen, maar uitstel is in deze geen afstel. Thank you for being with us this afternoon, or this morning, or this evening, or this night. I do not know where you are at the moment. Thank you for participating in enjoying two inspiring lectures. Stay safe. Take care for each other. Laten we goed zorg dragen voor elkaar in de komende weken. And I would say, for the moment, I would like to close this meeting. Ik verklaar deze zitting voor gesloten. Goodbye. Thank you again.